Thank you very much. And thank all those of you who have had the patience to come and sit through 3 different presentations of mine, and also thank you those who have not been able to come sooner but who have come today to test my very fragile knowledge of Latin America. In my first talk, I mainly used English language materials, and I talked about the language of contention in Western Europe and North America. In my second talk, I also used mainly European materials and only cited briefly some work on war and state building in Latin America, just to try and tempt people to think about the applicability of the Tillian model of war and state building to Latin America. Today I'm going to take a greater risk. I'm going to attempt to carry out a brief and speculative paired comparison between party system responses to critical junctures in Western Europe and Latin America. And it's a double risk. The first risk is because my knowledge of Latin America is so slight, and I have only recently begun seriously reading about contentious politics in Latin America. And the second risk, which I admit at the outset, is that I will be comparing 2 very different critical junctures. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term critical juncture comes from the work of the Colliers, mostly based on Argentina, but also on other Latin American countries, in which they describe what I would call cycles of contention. That is, periods of major structural change in the political economies of Latin America. Such a critical juncture for the Colliers and for many scholars of Latin America was the turn towards neoliberalization in Latin American political economies. And this turn towards neoliberalization began largely in the 1980s, and it involved virtually every country in Latin America, and it was driven by the International Monetary Fund's desire to stabilize the political economies of Latin America. Another critical juncture has more recently struck the part of the world that I'm more familiar with, and that is the Great Recession that has hit Europe since 2008. The second risk I will be taking in this talk is to compare the political responses to these 2 very different critical junctures: the neoliberal turn in Latin America and the Great Recession in Western Europe. So I'm taking a risk, but I think the risk is worth taking. And it's worth taking, first of all, because when you reach my age, you can afford to take some risks. But second of all, taking risks is the way we learn. If we only studied politics and economics within the boundaries of accepted geographical sectors, we would not learn very much. We learn much more by expanding the scope conditions of our theories. So if you will, what I would like to try and do today is to expand the scope conditions of a theory that comes out of Latin America and which is associated with the work of my colleague, who some of you know, Kenneth Roberts, who is one of the finest Latin American specialists and Andean specialists in the United States. I am going to try and expand the scope conditions of Roberts's work. And this is work with which many of you may not yet be familiar because it is new work, in which he is trying to show how the neoliberal turn affected different Latin American polities in different ways, according to which parties or coalitions were in power. I'm going to explain that theory of Roberts, and I'm going to try and apply it to two different Latin American countries, drawing on his work and that of others, Brazil and Bolivia. And then I am going to try and expand the scope conditions of his theory to include the two countries in Western Europe which I claim to know most about, and that is Italy and France. So if you will, I will be carrying out a paired comparison within Latin America between Bolivia and Brazil, within Western Europe between France and Italy, and then the larger paired comparison in which I will attempt to apply Roberts' theory of political party response to critical junctures to Western Europe. Now let me premise my presentation by asking a question, and it's a question I would ask of you, but ask of myself as well. Why in the world are there so few systematic comparisons between Western Europe and Latin America? Why in the world is this a new kind of comparison that I'm trying to carry out? Of course, there are works on democratization, like the work of O'Donnell and Schmitter, which look at the collapse of authoritarianism and the transition to democracy in Latin America and Southern Europe. And I have been involved in some of this work. But that work is largely at a historical structural level. It does not engage in the mechanics of party system response to economic crisis. What we do find is a certain number of Western Europeanists who look down at Latin America and who think that Latin Americanists should learn from Western Europe. And indeed, there's a great deal to learn from Western Europe because European democratic systems have lasted so much longer and are so much stable, more stable than Latin American ones. But what very few Europeanists have done is to try and learn from the experiences of Latin America. They have generally looked down upon Latin America as a continent which can and should learn from their own experience rather than the other way around. Because Europeans have a sense of their party systems as being established rather than unstable. They have a sense that their party systems are ideologically rather than personally structured. They have party systems which have grown up in the cleavage between working class parties and middle class parties, as opposed to the multi-class populism that has been so much more common in Latin America. And they have a strong state structuring of party systems. However, even the most rapid look at Western European politics may suggest that this sense of superiority is increasingly misplaced. Take populism, a term which is common in the study of Latin American political systems. It is increasingly common in Western Europe and particularly in Eastern Europe as well. And I will talk about one of these populist parties which has recently arisen in Italy, which will look very familiar to you. It will look very much like a Latin American populist party. Take the vaunted stability of Western European party systems. Those party systems, as I will demonstrate, are far less stable than they used to be. So we are finding, if you will, a Latin Americanization of European party systems. And we're finding something else as well, which Europeanists should welcome. And that is increasing attention to the interactions between parties and social movements. In Latin America, you have a long history of social movements challenging party systems. You have a long history, perhaps not quite as long, of social movements becoming parties. You have a long history of social movements taking over the state. Those processes are increasingly on the agenda in Western Europe as well. So, in order to make clear what I would like to convey, I'm going to look at one European party system in particular, that of Italy, which is looking more and more like a Latin American party system. Latin Americanists are increasingly interested in these comparisons. Kenneth Roberts, whose work I will quote in a few minutes, has been increasingly interested in these comparisons, and a very well-known younger political theorist from Chile, Cristobal Rovira, has also been paying attention to these comparisons. As Rovira writes in a recent essay, quote, "Although there are strong parallels between the economic crisis that Europe is facing today and the one that Latin America experienced during the 1980s and 1990s, there have been few scholarly comparative efforts." It is to make such a comparative scholarly efforts that I would like to talk about today. Now let me begin with the work of Kenneth Roberts. Am I going the right direction? Who is a friend and colleague and co-teacher and who's worked with Connie as well as with myself. Roberts did most of his early work on Latin American party systems, particularly in the Andes, but in part through my influence, he has become increasingly interested in contentious politics. His work on political parties is well known, and here are some of the best known ones. But what is less known is that he's now teaching about contentious politics. And this is drawn from the introduction to his course, his graduate seminar at Cornell. And if anybody who's doing a master's here at FLACSO is interested in studying parties and movements in Latin America at Cornell, he would be a very good person to work with. This is the kind of work that I've been trying to encourage in my talks here. It's the kind of work that does not separate party systems or institutional politics from social movements or from contentious politics. Now, what I would like to do is to draw on Roberts' more recent work in which he has been expanding his interests from political parties to contentious politics. And here are three pieces of work, some of which are already published, some of which are in process. The second one is his book that has just gone to press with Cambridge University Press, called Changing Course: Party System in Latin America's Neoliberal Era. But it is the first and the third papers, the first of which is published in Comparative Political Studies, that I'm going to draw upon today. What I'm going to draw upon is Roberts' systematic efforts to try and understand how different party systems and different governing coalitions have responded to the neoliberal crisis over the past 3 decades in Latin America. And here are his premises. First, that the neoliberal critical juncture was common to all of Latin America. But second, the political responses to that crisis were conditioned by the nature of each country's party system, and in particular, by which parties or coalitions were in power during the critical moment of the transition to neoliberalism. Roberts argues, in brief, that where there were center-right parties or coalitions in power during the critical moment of the transition to neoliberalism, the response of the electorate has been what he calls an aligning response. That is, a response within the existing party system. And the example I will use for that kind of aligning response is Brazil. But in contrast, where the parties or coalitions that were in power during the critical moment of the transition were either leftist parties or center-left coalitions, then the electorate's response has not been an aligning response, it's been a de-aligning response. By this term, Roberts means a response which overturns the existing alignment of party forces, a response which creates new parties, and a response which in some cases creates an entirely new type of party system. The example I will use for the de-aligning response is the case of Bolivia. So here is the summary of Roberts' argument. Where the center-right implemented neoliberalism, electoral reactions realigned party systems programmatically, providing institutional channels for the articulation of societal dissent from market orthodoxy. Where the center-left was in power, these critical junctures de-aligned party systems and channeled dissent into anti-system forms of social and political forces. Now notice that this is not either a party system hypothesis or a social movement hypothesis, it's the combination of the two. And it argues that there's a social movement response to the critical juncture only in some cases, only in cases where the party system is de-aligned. In other cases, particularly where the right is in power during the neoliberal change, the response may be important, as in Brazil, but that response is within the existing party system. So I wanted to know, first of all, how this theory held up in the two Latin American countries I looked at very briefly. But more important, I wanted to know whether such a model could be applied outside of Latin America, and whether it could be applied to a very different kind of critical juncture, the critical juncture of the Great Recession of 2008-2013. And here are some of the sources I used, which I'll just look at briefly, and I can give you the complete sources later on if you are interested. So here is the framework of the rest of what I'll say today. The critical juncture in Latin America is on the left-hand side. The critical juncture in Western Europe is on the right-hand side. The two kinds of party system outcomes that Roberts posits are on the left axis, either realigning or de-aligning. And the cases I'll look at very briefly in Latin America are Brazil and Bolivia, and in Western Europe, France and Italy. And I'll talk more about the European cases because I know more about them. So here we have a quick summary of the two realigning responses, or rather the two responses, realigning and de-aligning. In Brazil, a series of centrist and conservative governments in the 1980s and 90s implemented neoliberalism, and the party system was realigned to the left with the victory of the PT. In contrast, in Bolivia, a multi-party coalition implemented neoliberalism, what two American authors, Erica Simmons and her collaborator, call promiscuous power sharing, and that system was de-aligned by the creation of an anti-system coalition put together by Evo Morales. So here visually is the difference that we see between these two countries. Symbolically, what we see on the left is an election poster of Lula. On the right, what we see is a demonstration in the water wars of 2002. We're seeing collective action in both places, but in Brazil, collective action is within the party system. In Bolivia, collective action takes place outside the party system. I'm just going to skip all of these now and look at the data that Roberts has presented, which illustrates the difference in electoral volatility in the countries that he codes as undergoing aligning critical junctures, and in the countries in which he codes as experiencing de-aligning critical junctures. Let's skip the neutral, let's just look very briefly at these cases. These are summary statistics for all the Latin American countries which he codes like Brazil as being realigning, and the countries which he codes like Bolivia as being de-aligning. And what you can see is that the index of electoral volatility in the aligning systems was much lower than it was in the de-aligning systems, and that degree of volatility grew very rapidly in the de-aligning critical junctures, going from 28% of the total to 41% between 2000 and 2010, with an overall increase in volatility of 13.0. In contrast, Roberts finds in the aligning system there was actually a decline in electoral volatility between the 1980 and 2000 period and the 2000-2010 period. So if we look generally at Latin America, there is statistical support for Roberts' theory. Those countries in which there was a realignment within the party system had a very low level of appearance of new political parties. Those countries in which there was a de-aligning critical juncture, in which the left or the center-left was in power and engaged in what Roberts calls bait-and-switch policies, there was a high degree of volatility. Let me illustrate the differences in the two countries that I've focused on, Brazil and Bolivia. If you look at the chart, you will see that there is a sharp difference in the percentage of legislative seats captured by new parties formed after 1990 between Brazil and Bolivia. The percentage is virtually zero in Brazil during this 30-year period. The percentage shoots up from 0 to almost 100% in Bolivia. We are looking at two very different electoral realignments, one of which took place largely within the party system in Brazil, one of which virtually created a new party system. And the correlation that Roberts points to here is that in the Brazilian case, it was a center-right party that, or coalition that administered the implementation of neoliberalism. It was defeated, but by a center-left party within the party system. In contrast, Morales and the MAS created virtually a new system. Now we turn to Western Europe, we find that the degree of party system change during the Great Recession was much less than in Latin America. After all, many people would say the Latin American party systems have been destroyed over the past 20 years, and that is not the case in any of the European systems. For example, there has been no president overthrown in any of these Western European countries, but there have been changes in political alignments. There have been great waves of social protest, and there have been de-alignments, particularly in those countries which experienced the greatest recession and the highest rates of unemployment. Countries like Iceland, Greece, and Italy, but also countries like Spain and Portugal as well. But here is a symbolic difference, an important symbolic difference. When we turn to France, we see a major change in party realignment. We see the center-right government of Nicolas Sarkozy replaced in the 2012 election by a center-left coalition. Very similarly to the kind of bipolar circulation of elites that we saw in Brazil in 2002. But in contrast, in what Italians call la sorella latina, in Italy, we see a fundamental change in the party system with the intrusion of a new, radical, and for some people preposterous, populist leader, Beppe Grillo, who until his eruption onto the political scene was a television comedian, who used the new tools. Now, many Italians would say, oh, well, all of our politicians are comedians. But this guy was a real comedian. And over the past 4 or 5 years of political unrest, he has become more and more political, and he has been using the new tools of electronic mobilization to create a fundamentally new party, the Five Star Movement. And he's recruited supporters for the Five Star Movement on the internet. This is the first time in a major Western European country that the internet has become an instrument of mobilization, and not only an instrument of mobilization for voters, but an instrument of mobilization for candidates as well. Many of the candidates that ran on Grillo's Five Star Movement election campaign recruited themselves on the internet. They filled in questionnaires. And if it seemed as if they were sufficiently critical of the existing party system, Grillo would send them an email message saying, "Congratulations, you have been selected to run for parliament on the list of the Movimento 5 Stelle." So this is something fundamentally new. And what is most striking about it was that in the elections of 2013, Grillo and his party gained 25% of the vote, coming from absolutely nowhere. Let me see if I can find some statistics which will help. Let me skip this because this is general. It comes from Hans-Peter Kriese's work. Here is a comparison between electoral volatility in Italy and France between the pre-crisis and the post-crisis period. And you can see that in France, the volatility overall is much lower. The degree of change in volatility is much lower, and that in Italy, a relatively low level of volatility before the crisis, that is 6.5% change in the appearance of new parties. That moved from 6.5% to almost half, almost 50% of the party system overturned in the election of 2013, an increase in volatility of almost 30%. What was the difference between the two systems? Following Roberts' analysis, we can hypothesize that the difference in the two systems was that in France, an established center-right party was defeated by an established center-left coalition, very similar to the dynamics of the response to neoliberalism in Brazil. In Italy, in contrast, a technically non-party government led by economist Mario Monti, but supported by a coalition of center-left and center-right, was defeated in the elections of 2013. So if you will, with adjustments made for the fact that we are dealing with a very different party system, the Italian case is closer to the Brazilian case, whereas the French case, to the Bolivian case, whereas the French case is closer to the Brazilian one. Now, I have only just begun to think about these comparisons, and as has probably been evident, my knowledge of Latin American politics is very fragile, but it is growing, and I'm hoping to learn more from you and from other colleagues who work in Latin American politics as I circulate this paper. But I think we can come to a couple of cautious conclusions about these large-scale comparisons. First, I think that it demonstrates that the countries were different, their party systems were different, and they have very different degrees of institutionalization. And the nature of the crises that cause these changes are different as well. And yet, there are striking parallels between the two sets of cases, parallels which depend upon the nature of the party or coalition that is in power at the time of the critical juncture. Second, I hope I've demonstrated that comparisons between very different systems can be revealing if they can uncover similar mechanisms. And the mechanisms that Roberts describes are, on the one hand, the mechanism of partisan realignment within a party system, and on the other hand, the mechanism of what he calls bait and switch. When a leftist or a center-left coalition comes to power criticizing neoliberalism and then turns around and, under the pressure of international banking institutions, continues to implement the neoliberal policies of its predecessors. That mechanism of bait and switch, which is American slang for coming to power with one program and then implementing a different program, that mechanism appears to have existed equally in Bolivia and Italy, and the responses of the electorate appear to have been different. The result in both cases was a de-alignment of the existing system. Now, I don't know whether the correlation that I've suggested would hold for all other European political systems facing the Great Recession. I haven't had time to look into these other countries, and I haven't yet had the opportunity to consult my colleague Europeanists who are experts on those party systems. But what I hope to have accomplished is to have shown that Latin America is no longer the little sister of Western Europe, that processes that are uncovered and analyzed by scholars of Latin American politics can then be extended and expanded and tested by their application to parts of the world which have longer and supposedly more stable party systems. I also hope that I may have encouraged some of you who are here today to be thinking more broadly about the place of Ecuador in these dynamics. As I've said in my first two talks, I am not going to try and answer questions about Ecuador among the Ecuadorians, but it is for you to think of whether there are lessons from these paired comparisons which may be relevant to your own country and to its party system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. So we have some time now for questions and comments. So please, if you have any questions or comments, raise your hand and the microphone will pass. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I have Thank you, Professor Tarrow, for your lecture. I have a question, perhaps it's not for you, but for Roberts, but I just wonder if you have come across with the same idea. And the question has to do with the temporal dimension, about thinking about the alignment process in the political parties. Indeed, in the last years, I'm talking from Colombia, new parties have emerged, but after a certain period of time, you find that by the results, they are not so new. By the process you find, by the results, you find that they are basically the same. It's the old wine in new bottles. So the question is if this analysis by Roberts is just only synchronic and surely perhaps a weak perspective is not taking into account the historical dimension and the perspective that what has occurred in the last years in Latin America about the new parties, like saying the new social movements. How far we can talk about new parties, not based on the political actors, but also thinking about the processes and the results of those actors. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take a few questions?
Yes. Yeah. Ahí, sí. Patricia. Sí.
Thanks, Professor. I've got a question. I'd like you to ask about the representation. I think representation is an important concept in the political way. And representation, I think, is a weak link between social movements and the political party. I would like to ask about your opinion about that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I have a question about also Robert's model, because I wonder if the type of transition from the authoritarian regime to democracy and the characteristics of the party system that were developed in Brazil and its characteristics of inclusion of the social movements during that period, if these aspects influenced this, the phenomenon that he is analyzing in an abstraction from the historical aspects that happened before. Because I think that in Bolivia, there is a less inclusion of certain social movements and from certain demands from certain social actors than in Brazil, where the transition was a specific, of certain aspects where many demands of social movements were included.
Okay, let me see if I can shed some light on these three very interesting questions. Let me begin with the third one. I don't know your name, but you ask good questions. And that is, my knowledge of Brazil comes mostly from the work of two North American scholars, Margaret Keck and my former student, Wendy Hunter, both of whom have done studies of the PT. And both of those studies reinforce the point I think you were making, that is, that the PT went through a long period of absorption of social movements until such point at which those social movements either became part of the PT or, as the case is the case of the Movimiento Sin Tierra, have a very close relationship with the PT. So I think you're absolutely correct about that. Whether the MAS has a less inclusive relationship with the social movements that helped to bring it to power, I'm not equipped to say, but it may just be simply too soon to understand whether there has been an inclusion, particularly of the indigenous movements. My source here is Carlos de la Torre, who believes that the MAS has successfully integrated the indigenous movements which helped bring the party to power. But I do believe it may be too soon, and during the last 2 years, we've been seeing conflicts between several of the indigenous groups and the government, particularly over the issue of the creation of a new highway through the rainforest, which one of my students, Simon Velasquez, happens to be studying. So I would hesitate to come to any strong inference, because I really think it may be too long. On the issue of the representation and the representative link between parties and movements, social movements very seldom can claim to be representative. If they are representative at all, it's a form of virtual representation. Social movements don't generally create the mechanisms to represent individuals. They either believe that they are the direct emanation of the groups that they represent, or they believe that they have a symbolic relationship to the people. And that's a fundamental difference between movements and parties, which I think is part of what you were saying. And it's part of the major problem of the transition from a movement to a party. Can you transform a movement into a party without creating mechanisms for representation? And this is a very difficult thing to carry out, and many movements never succeed in doing so. And the result is we have a large number of parties that emanate from social movements, claiming to represent those movements, but without creating mechanisms for their representation. De la Torre, writing about a country which you may know about, uses the term technocratic populism. Now, that may be a little extreme in referring to the country he's talking about, but it does capture the idea of a movement party which does not create the mechanisms for representation, but which believes in its virtual representation of its constituency. Now, the idea of new parties being not so new. And I'm very familiar with this process because I've been studying France for many years, and it is quite striking that many French parties appear to be new because they have a new name, but are really the same party in another guise. In fact, it was very difficult to carry out the analysis of volatility in France, because here were all of these apparently new parties which were actually the same party with a new name. But I'm not so sure that this is true in Latin America, at least during the last decade, when most experts, at least those who I've read, believe that the older party systems really have been liquidated and new party systems are being created. And in the creation of new party systems, there clearly are new parties, which may be similar to old parties in their campaigns and in their ideologies, but which bring a new logic of policy making. And here, I think the case of Ecuador is a very positive case. And I think I've studied it long enough to understand that the Correa government is really bringing a new pattern of policy making to the state with a new degree of centralization and a new degree of planification. That's something fundamentally new for Ecuador. And I think whether it's true of Colombia or not, I'm not equipped to say. But I do believe that the collapse of the old party systems has really created space for new parties to appear.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you. I'm wondering if, I'm sorry, my name is Michelle, and I'm wondering if it might be worth exploring a little bit more the one difference you pointed out in the very beginning of your lecture, where you mentioned that it's a little bit newer to Western European party systems to involve social movements into their day-to-day work. So I would be interested in learning what you think about that particular difference, because in Latin America, I would say it's not so new. It's almost cyclical, but maybe Western European cycles are bigger. I don't know enough about it, but I would love to hear what you think.
I can answer that quickly. I think I either misspoke or I was not clear enough. As a student of the history of Western European party systems, I believe that the linkage with social movements has been recurring. Think, for example, of the Italian Fascist Party that came to power in 1922, which is a party I've studied carefully. It was a social movement, and the link between movement and parties is quite clear. What I thought I was saying, and what I should have said, was that Western European scholars have become so specialized that those who study parties very seldom pay any attention to movements. And those who study movements very seldom pay any attention to parties because they look down on parties. Parties are bourgeois, parties are institutionalized, parties are bureaucratic. They look down upon them, and they don't like parties, they like movements. So there's an anthropological segmentation between students of political parties and students of social movements that makes it very difficult to actually see the connections that do exist and that you have pointed to.
Más preguntas. Felipe.
A mí me da la impresión de que a esta presentación suya o al esquema analítico que usted acaba de presentar se le podría
Could you use your wonderful English?
I feel shy with my English in these spaces.
Because I'm not getting it.
I feel that it will be possible to make a critique of the scheme that you present this morning, to compare the cases of Brazil and Bolivia with the cases of France and Italy, because it seems to me that you are losing the analytic perspective of contentious politics. It seems to me that your scheme is to center on is trying to explain the changes in the political party system, just focusing on how institutionalized are the political systems in each country, and which were the coalitions of government in each country. But it seems to me that the change in this process depends on the contentious politics in each country. If you compare, for example, the critical junctures in Brazil and Bolivia, they are completely different, and they are completely different precisely of the contention, the cycle of contentions politics in those two countries. Mm-hmm. So probably you can explain the change in the political system, not focusing on the coalitions of government, but in the dynamics of contentious politics. I don't know if I am clear in my question. That's why I don't like to ask questions in English in this kind of.
I understood your question, and I also understood why you are the dean of political studies, because you have put a knife right into the middle of my model. But I can defend myself. As a student of contentious politics, I would have preferred to have presented evidence on the degree and on the type of contention in these different countries. And I would have found, I think, as you say, major differences between Brazil and Bolivia. I think so, but I cannot demonstrate it. And the reason I cannot demonstrate it is because we scholars of contentious politics are much slower in collecting systematic data on contention than the students of elections. Students of elections go to the Interior Ministry and they get the statistics, canned data, which they can then use to calculate the degree of party system change, the degree of volatility, the degree of turnout. These are all systematic forms of data that are instantly available to students of parties and elections. We poor scholars of contentious politics have to collect protest event data laboriously, and it sometimes takes years until that data is available and can be calculated and coded. Now, the reason I use data on volatility was because, and here I follow Roberts, I'm using it as a proxy for contentious politics. I do not think volatility in itself is interesting. What it is an indirect way of demonstrating that there's contention going on in the electorate, as evidenced by their willingness to vote for new and untried parties rather than existing parties. So it's an indirect measure. It's perhaps not a very adequate measure, but it's all we've got for the moment. Until scholars who are using the systematic methods of protest event analysis can collect the data that can demonstrate how contentious politics responded to these critical junctures, that's about all we can do. And let me cite, by the way, the work of my colleague from Rio de Janeiro, Breno Bringel, who has been collecting protest event data on the recent wave of protests in Rio during last summer. This is the kind of work that I have been trying to encourage and of which we have far too little in Latin America. So I confess that you are correct, but I hope I can take the knife out of my model and defend myself because of the absence of the kind of data that you and I would like to see.
¿Otra pregunta? ¿Arriba?
No sé si se puede hablar en español.
Sí.
¿Sí?
Sí, gracias.
Bueno, mi pregunta era un poco relacionada en torno a lo que has dicho de que el colapso del sistema de partidos está ocurriendo ahora, sobre todo en el sur de Europa, y están... ¿No?
Excuse me. It's in Spanish.
Change the channel.
No? Say something. I hear you now.
¿Sí? ¿Hola? ¿Funciona?
Spanish. I hear you now. Okay. Yes.
¿Sí? ¿Ahora ya? Sí, vale.
Yes.
Bueno, no era referente a lo que comentabas anteriormente del colapso del sistema de partidos, fundamentalmente en el sur de Europa, y que estaban apareciendo nuevos partidos que estaban, digamos, de alguna manera representando a la frágil credibilidad del sistema de partidos convencional que existía. Pero mi pregunta era en relación a esos nuevos movimientos sociales que no tendrían esa forma de acción política dentro de la acción convencional, dentro de sistemas, dentro de partidos o sindicatos, sobre todo dentro de las izquierdas. ¿Qué rol crees que van a jugar frente a las políticas de austeridad que está habiendo actualmente?
Do you want to collect more? You want to collect more questions? You want to answer?
I didn't understand the question. I understood what you were saying, but I didn't understand what the question was.
What is the role that is going to play the social movements in nowadays in the south of Europe?
Okay. Okay. So I think you were asking a factual question. I think your question is not about the research that I presented, but a prediction of what is going to happen next. And I'm not very good at predicting, particularly in countries that are undergoing such fundamental change. But the one thing I can say, which I think goes in the direction of your question, is that there has been a remarkably rapid transition from social movements to political parties in the countries like Spain, Portugal, and especially Greece and Italy, in which there has been a great deal of social movement activity. So what we're seeing is increased contentious politics, but we're also seeing a shift from the social movement sphere into the institutionalized party sphere. And the country in which this dynamic is most advanced is the United States. If you think that the Tea Party movement first appeared in 2010 as an independent social movement at the grassroots, the Tea Party has now become a fundamental faction within the Republican Party. It is no longer an independent social movement. It's part of the party system. That's happened very rapidly. And I think we see a similar phenomenon occurring in the Italian case, which I've already demonstrated, and I think it is also occurring in Greece. Spain and Portugal, perhaps not so much. So we're seeing both the emergence of contentious politics and the transformation from contentious politics into institutional politics. That's just my impression, but you're asking me a factual question to predict the future, and I'm not so good at that.
¿Más preguntas?
Hi, thank you for your presentation today. So correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially part of your thesis is that having strong party systems supports collective action within the government, and when you have weak party systems, that's when it trails off and becomes the people against the government and leads to golpe de estados and coups and such. So my question is, I know you didn't talk a lot, well, I know you didn't talk about bipartisan issues or anything, but I'm wondering which is easier to fix, building stronger party systems or breaking down strong attitudes of bipartisan issues, such as, like, an example in the United States, Republicans versus Democrats, where it's become an issue where people cling to their party, and their parties are constantly changing, ideas are forming and whatnot, and people stand for a party that doesn't actually represent their ideas anymore. So, yeah, essentially my question is, which is easier to fix, breaking down bipartisan issues or building up party systems?
So I think I may not have been entirely clear in describing the independent variable. I was not comparing strong party systems with weak party systems. For Roberts and for me, the independent variable is not the strength of the party system, but which party or coalition is in power and is responsible for implementing neoliberal policies. When the center-right is in power, the neoliberal policies are native to those parties. They believe in those policies. Neoliberalism comes from the heart of conservative parties. And when they implement those policies, and the policies negatively affect the lower classes, what we have is a realignment within the party system. That doesn't have to do with the strength of the party system, it has to do with who's in power. And in contrast, when the left or the center-left is elected with a campaign against neoliberalism and then implements neoliberalism, its base feels betrayed and does not move from the center-left to the center-right, but moves outside the party system altogether in episodes of collective action and the creation of new parties. I hope that's clearer now. Thanks. Perhaps one more question, if there is one.
Sí. Bueno, voy a hablar en español. Tengo una pregunta que quizá tenga que ver un poco con el compañero. Bueno, sabemos que los movimientos sociales en Latinoamérica y en algunas zonas de Europa se han transformado o han creado partidos políticos. Bueno, a partir de esa premisa, la pregunta que yo le hago a usted es, ¿usted piensa que estos partidos emergidos de movimientos sociales son distintos en calidad, cualitativamente distintos, o son, movimientos sociales que a través de un proceso de institucionalización dejan de ser movimientos sociales y se convierten en partidos políticos, con una institucionalización, puede ser débil, fuerte, no sé, pero finalmente son partidos, de un formato clásico? Esa es mi pregunta.
I think it's a good question, but I don't think there's a simple answer. And I think the answer is different for different countries. If we look at Venezuela, I think we see the case of a political party social movement that has continued to have both aspects. Whatever we think of Chavez and Maduro, this is a party that has continued to be responsive to its social movement base and has continued to rely upon its social movement base. If you looked at the demonstration on Tel Asur the other day, you will see thousands of people with red baseball caps marching on behalf of the government. That's a social movement base that is continually mobilized by the government. In partial contrast to that, in Bolivia, there are signs of a fracture between the social movement base of the MAS and the party once it comes to power. Parties that come to power are faced with the inevitable compromises of exercising power, and where those parties have a strong social movement base, it is often impossible to maintain the unity of the party. And so we have a growing fracture between parts of the original base of the MAS and the party itself in power. In Ecuador, there's still another situation. In Brazil, there's still another situation. In other words, I don't think that because these countries are all in Latin America and because they have all gone through a similar process of transformation, that they will all end up as institutionalized political parties of the same kind. This is what makes Latin America such a wonderful laboratory for social science, because there are significant common trends, like the neoliberal critical juncture, like the shift to the left during the last decade, and like what appears to be happening now. There are similar trends across Latin American countries, but each one of these trends is filtered through different party systems, different coalitions, and different strategies of leaders. And that's why this is a wonderful laboratory for comparative analysis. And it's one which I would hope to do more of as I become more familiar with this part of the world. So let me thank you all for coming, and thank you for your excellent questions.